In Marxian economics, economic reproduction refers to recurrent processes. Aglietta views economic reproduction as the initial conditions necessarily for economic activity to occur, constantly recreated. Marx viewed reproduction as the means by which society recreated itself both materially and socially. The recreation of the conditions necessarily for economic activity to take place was a key part of that. A capitalist would need to reproduce a certain social hierarchy of workers who owned nothing but the labor power and of others who controlled the capital necessary to make production start. Thus, the process of reproduction would need to recreate workers as workers, and capitalists as capitalists. Economic reproduction involves the physical production and distribution of goods and services, the trade of goods and services, and the consumption of goods and services. Karl Marx developed the original insights of Kesnet to model the circulation of capital, money, and commodities in the second volume of Das Kapital to show how the reproduction process that must occur in any type of society can take place in capitalist society by means of the circulation of capital. Marx distinguishes between simple reproduction and expanded reproduction. In the former case, no economic growth occurs, while in the latter case, more is produced than is needed to maintain the economy at the given level, making economic growth possible. In the capitalist mode of production, the difference is that in the former case, the new surplus value created by wage labor is spent by the employer on consumption, whereas in the latter case, part of it is reinvested in production. Ernest Mandel additionally refers in his two-volume Marxist economic theory to contracted reproduction, meaning production on a smaller and smaller scale, in which case business operating at a loss outnumbers growing business. Reproduction in this case continues to occur, but investment, employment, and output fall absolutely, so that the national income falls. In the Great Depression of the 1930s, for example, about 1/4 of the workers became unemployed. As a result of the 2008-9 slump, the unemployed labor force increased by about 30 million workers. Theoretical approach. As an approach to studying economic activity, economic reproduction contrasts with equilibrium economics, because economic reproduction is concerned not with statics or with how economic development gravitates towards an equilibrium, but rather with dynamics, that is, the motion of an economy. It is not concerned with the conditions of a perfect match between supply and demand under ideal conditions, but rather with the quantitative proportions between different economic activities or sectors that are necessary in any real economy so that economic activity can continue and grow. It is concerned with all the conditions for that, including the social and technical conditions necessarily for the economic process. Reproduction economics does not assume that society is kept in balance by market mechanisms. Vasily Leontief developed Marx's idea further in his input-output economics. However, there is a major difference between Leontief and Marx. By treating gross profit as a factor input as well as a factor output, the respective total values of the input and output in Leontief's model are always exactly equal. In Marx's model, the output in an accounting period is normally always higher in value than the input. This is what Marx believed capitalists to be in business for, to produce a product sold at a higher value than the sum of input costs, thus generating profit. The profit in Marx's theory is not an input, but a business result, the yield of capital on an investment. In Marx's view, economic reproduction in any society has 5 main features: the production of reproducible products replacing, maintaining, or adding to the stock of society's physical assets, the physical maintenance of the population and the dependence through household consumption, the reproduction and growth of the total population, including procreation and child-rearing, the reproduction, enforcement, and maintenance of social relations, in particular the relations of production that characterize the social hierarchy, and property rights, the maintenance and reproduction of trading and distribution relations. What is specific to capitalist society is that these reproduction processes are accomplished primarily via the intermediary of commercial trade. That is, they are mediated by the market. Reproduction on a larger and larger scale becomes conditional on successfully making money. It means that these processes tend to be increasingly reorganized to bring them in line with the requirements of the accumulation of capital. Marx's argument is that by producing an output value the equivalent to their own labor cost plus a surplus value appropriated by capitalists, waged workers accomplish many of the processes involved at the same time. Part of the role of the state is to secure those general conditions for the reproduction and maintenance of society that individuals and private enterprise cannot secure by themselves for one reason or another. Ecologists would nowadays probably add as a reproduction condition good stewardship for the physical environment. Sustainable development cannot occur if the natural environment is constantly depleted without being restored. The recycling of wastes and waste materials can be considered as a necessary and integral part of society's reproduction process. Each of these 6 features is the subject of much political controversy in society. Many different opinions exist about the relative importance and their effects on each other. Economists and businesspeople are often primarily concerned with the economic effects, but other intellectuals and workers are often more concerned with the non-economic effects for the health, security, and well-being of citizens. Thus, governments usually have both economic policies and social policies, population policies, environmental policies, and so on. Economic reproduction in capitalism. According to Marx, in a capitalist society, economic reproduction is conditional on capital accumulation. If workers fail to produce more capital, economic reproduction begins to break down. Therefore, economic reproduction in capitalist society is necessarily expanded reproduction and requires market growth. Capital must grow, otherwise the whole process breaks down. Thus, economic growth is not simply desirable but also necessary in capitalism, not just because of population growth but for commercial reasons. In this light, the ecological vision of a zero-growth society appears rather utopian, or, at the very least, its achievement would require the abolition of capitalism. Some would argue that population growth makes economic growth absolutely necessary. Others argue that population growth must be restricted with birth control methods because otherwise there will be too many people for the available resources. The real argument, though, is not about growth or the lack thereof, but rather about the kind of growth that is best for the reproduction of the human species as such. Ecologists may validly argue that some types of growth undermine important conditions for human survival in the longer term without invalidating other kinds of growth that are beneficial. However, there is much dispute about which kinds of economic growth are beneficial or harmful. Capital accumulation can occur either by producing a net addition to the stock of capital assets or by transferring wealth from one owner to another. In the former case, the total stock of capital grows. In the latter case, the accumulation of one owner occurs at the expense of the other. There is no net growth. These two ways are usually combined, meaning that all or most owners make gains, but in unequal amounts. In considering the economic reproduction process as a whole, one therefore has to consider both the production of new resources and the transfer of resources. As a corollary, supposing that there is no net growth of output and capital, capital accumulation can continue only if some people and organizations get richer while other people and organizations get poorer. Typically, if output growth slows down, socio-economic inequality increases. 9 factors not theorized by Marx. There were 9 main factors that Marx disregarded in his construction of reproduction schemes when he modeled the circulation of capital. These omissions have been noted by various Marxist and non-Marxist authors. The sphere of consumption. Marx did not go into detail about how capitalist business reshapes, reorganizes, and restructures the mode of consumption so that it becomes more profitable. He concerned himself primarily with the capitalist mode of production, not with the capitalist mode of consumption. Unproductive accumulation. Through successive cycles of economic reproduction, more and more capital assets are created that exist outside the sphere of capitalist production. These capital assets include residential housing, improved and unimproved land, publicly owned physical assets including offices, hospitals, schools, roads, installations, parks, vehicles, equipment, and infrastructural works, consumer durables, and all kinds of financial assets. These assets can also yield profits, income gains, or capital gains insofar as their tradable goods are rented out. For example, there is nowadays a large trade in used cars, second-hand equipment, and housing, as well as in financial assets. In fact, in developed capitalist countries, the capital directly tied up in private sector means of production is nowadays only the minor part of the total physical capital assets of society. If financial assets are included, the proportion of this part shrinks even more. Human capital and labor markets. Marx did not analyze the effects of human capital, that is, the skills and knowledge lodged in the physical bodies of workers, and the very large sums of money invested into education systems. He was aware of the idea of human capital, but he regarded it as a fictitious, reified notion that, he argued, would imply that workers were really capitalists. Nevertheless, the stock of skills and knowledge in the economy can represent a very large tradable value, which can profoundly influence economic relationships, insofar as workers can increase their income because they possess specialized skills and knowledge. Considerable money is spent on education and research and development in developed capitalist countries. Marx intended to write a separate study about the labor market, considering the different forms that wages could take, but he never did. Rent-seeking. Marx did not analyze the effects of rent-seeking for economic reproduction. In conventional economics, the term rent-seeking was coined in 1974, and refers mainly to a form of parasitism or economic opportunism by government bureaucrats in a privileged position. Definitions of economic rent are much disputed in economic theory, but in radical theory they refer to an unearned income that derives from a favorable trading position or from the monopolization of a resource. Marx only considered the special case of land rent, but modern theorists argue that the scope of economic rents has become much larger. If investors can earn rents simply by capitalizing on the ownership or use of a resource, then, if this sort of activity makes more profit faster, with less risk and lower tax than investing in production, capital will shift more and more to trade in already existing assets. If there exists plenty of such assets, a very large trade in such assets can develop, causing speculative bubbles. The result is that output growth is curbed and may even turn negative. Thus, the relative proportions of industry profits, interest, and rent income in total surplus value have a decisive effect on the ability of the economy to grow. The more the interest and rent that must be paid for production to occur, the more this becomes a constraint for expanding production. If the population increases, output, investments, and jobs necessarily have to grow to keep up with it. But in a complex system of financial intermediation involving rent-seeking, economic growth may fail to occur on a sufficient scale, and in that case, some groups can only improve their economic position at the expense of others. This argument, however, is also disputed by many theorists. The objection is simply that well-developed capital and money markets ensure that the finance exists to develop production, and that without a strong financial sector, production would be starved of funds. Non-capitalist economic areas. In his theory of capital, Marx failed to consider the importance and weight of the non-capitalist production activities that must occur to sustain capitalist production. He was primarily concerned to show that the reproduction of society as a whole could in principle be accomplished by means of the accumulation of capital. All the activities of economic production can, Marx argued, in principle be organized in a capitalist way. It's applied proof that the capitalist mode of production could exist as an historically distinctive world system, completely dominated by the requirements of capital, without quickly breaking down. But this idea was strongly criticized, especially by German Marxist authors such as Rosa Luxemburg and Fritz Sternberg. They argued that capital accumulation proceeds only by constantly drawing upon a non-capitalist hinterland or region. That is, markets can expand only if there are new, non-capitalist areas to expand into, but inversely, these non-capitalist areas could actually support the capitalist economy well in advance of becoming thoroughly organized according to commercial principles. This idea is developed further by the Marxist David Harvey, who uses the concept of accumulation by dispossession. Population growth. Marx failed to systematically theorize the impact of demographic effects on economic reproduction, except that he studied the reserve army of labor and criticized the overpopulation theories of Thomas Malthus. Malthus was anxious that population growth would outstrip the capacity of the economy to sustain all the new people. Marx replied that the very idea of overpopulation was an anti-human ideological fiction, since it really meant overpopulation only relative to the requirements of capital accumulation. If resources were appropriately allocated, there was enough for everybody to have a decent life. The real point was that capital could not achieve that goal. Capital accumulation necessitated a relative surplus population, which tended to grow in size. Nevertheless, since population trends are not simply determined by economic factors, population movements can exert an important independent effect on economic reproduction. In China, population growth has been curbed by deliberate government policy to restrict the number of births per couple, using birth control methods. Another aspect about which there is much controversy is the emigration of workers and refugee populations, whether they are an asset for, or a drain on, economic growth. Capitalists are generally in favor of the free international movement of capital, but they are much more cautious about freedom of movement for workers, depending on whether that movement is profitable to them or whether it is a cost or a political threat. public finance. Marx did not analyze in any detail the effect of taxation and state expenditures on the reproduction process. In his time, state taxes and expenditures were comparatively small, but since that time they have risen to 30% to 40% or more of gross product in many countries. They enable the state to intervene directly in the process of social and economic reproduction, and to alter its course within certain limits. Because of the size of state funds and the fact that taxes must be paid irrespective of productive performance, the state can borrow large sums and use them, together with legislation, to influence economic growth and social relations. In addition, the state nowadays also employs a very large number of people earning incomes from activity that is often and mostly not oriented to profit-making, analogous to a non-profit sector sustained by subsidies, grants, and donations, as well as some income-generating activity. The state is the largest sponsor and purchaser of the military industry supplying the armed forces. Ecology. Although he did refer to it, Marx did not analyze in detail the depletion of natural resources by capitalist production, where the depletion involves non-reproducible goods, or living organisms that are wiped out. If land is exhausted or becomes infertile, or if it is devastated by a natural disaster, or if the yield of mines, forests, and fisheries becomes too low, production can no longer continue. After a series of cycles of capitalist reproduction, environments may emerge that are no longer inhabitable by human beings because they are incapable any longer of sustaining life. International division of labor. Through mechanization and productivity increases achieved by capitalist production, the allocation of human labor between agriculture, manufacturing industries, and services is altered nationally and internationally. In developed capitalist countries, the agricultural labor force has shrunk to only a tiny fraction of the total workforce, and manufacturing industries remain only as a minor part of total production. The large majority of workers are employed in service industries. This contrasts with less developed countries, which retain a large agricultural workforce, and newly industrializing countries, which feature a large manufacturing workforce. Marx did not analyze the implications of these long-term effects of the expansion of production by means of capital accumulation. In assessing the effect of these emissions, one ought to keep in mind that when Marx discussed the intertwining of the circulation of capital with the reproduction processes that occur in any kind of society, he was primarily concerned with the functional requirements of the capitalist mode of production and not with the reproduction of the whole of society. At any time, a fraction of the population is not working or economically active, and assets are maintained or accumulated that are unrelated to the sphere of production. These were generally outside the scope of Marx's analysis, even if he occasionally mentioned them.